All right, guys, we left our discussion on our fourth enlightened thinker, Voltaire. I'm going to start here. All right, so Voltaire is a French philosopher, a French enlightened thinker. Dates are there a little bit later, again, going somewhat chronologically. And his most famous work is called The Philosophical Dictionary, which he wrote in 1764. He also has a ton of firsthand accounts, letters, diaries, pamphlets on various works of literature and his thoughts and feelings about the Enlightenment. Some of highlighted in some of these letters and pamphlets, Voltaire is a strict defender of the freedom of speech as well as the freedom of religion. Right, two things that we will see carry into modern day analysis and modern day governments. He also is an advocate for the separation of church and state and religious toleration, meaning people should be able to freely practice whatever religion they want. The separation of church and state, church is one side of the spectrum, state means government, that's on the other. Those should be totally separate entities. They should be organized and run as different beings. And Voltaire was a staunch supporter of those things. As a whole, more negatively, he actually is a harsh critic of religion as a whole, as I mentioned. All of the religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, he kind of knocks them all, which is really the backing for why he is a defender of freedom of religion, freedom of speech. He thinks people should, be able to say and feel what they want. And that's Voltaire, a brilliant mind, late 18th century here, with some interesting thoughts, very modern day thoughts that we continue to see. All right, next up we have Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He is also a French philosopher, a little bit earlier, early 18th century. And his most famous work is called The Social Contract. Now, I mentioned this idea before. His work of literature is called The Social Contract. We'll say his book, 1762. His beliefs, again, it's the same idea. A social contract is a contract, not a written one, not an actual piece of paper that you're signing, but an idea that exists between governments and their people. And he says it exists to form a civil society that monarchs must legislate. He says monarchs need to run the contract, but people are involved. There's two parts of it. He also says, and again, we'll talk some more specifics. We'll read a little piece of that social contract, but it's this contract exists. And one side, the people agree to one thing, the monarchs agree to another, and you have to abide by that contract. And it's the monarch's job to legislate that. And another thought or another theme or another idea, that Rousseau has is called popular sovereignty. And if we look at the word popular, that refers to people, the population, right? To be sovereign is to be free, not to be free, to rule. To be sovereign sovereignty is rule. So he says popular rule, people should rule. Governments are created and sustained by the consent of its people. He also is going to defend individual freedoms. So three very different thoughts: social contract, popular sovereignty, defender of individual freedom. Rousseau is a well-rounded, enlightened thinker, but he thinks government should be made by the people. Countries should be ruled by the people, for the people. He's going to defend individual freedoms, and he thinks that this contract exists, this idea exists between people and governments. So that's Rousseau. Next, our first woman enlightened thinker, a brilliant mind as well, back to England as an English philosopher. She wrote a work of literature called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And vindication means to be free or to be freed. And her beliefs are just that. Women should have individual and civil liberties. Women are not inferior to men by any means. I would argue that it's the opposite, in a lot of ways at least. But women are behind the curve because they're not educated. Men have priority when it comes to education, especially wealthy education in England and in France and in Europe as a whole. And women are not able to hold political positions. They're not able to be on the same level as men because they don't have that education. And that's what Mary Wollstonecraft says. She says it shouldn't be about that. Men and women should have equal political and educational rights. It's not fair that women do not at the time. And she's absolutely right. And as a whole, she's going to urge equality for all men and women. Really a very early feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft. In her, we'll read a little bit of a vindication of the rights of women. Super, super important. So that's our first and actually the only woman philosopher we'll talk about, but her ideas, still resonate with us today. All right, next on the list, we have Denis Diderot. Denis Diderot. The S and the T are silent. That's a French linguistics thing. So he's a French philosopher, and he's actually responsible for writing the world's first encyclopedia, with the title in French there, 1751. And basically the goal for him was to create an encyclopedia. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to collect and distribute the ideas that all of these philosophers that we've been talking about have come up with. And he was able to do that. He basically collects these works of literature and compiles them together to form our understanding of the modern day encyclopedia. And that was spread around for a number of reasons, via the printing press, of course. And it started to really drive a lot of change, political change and social change, meaning people would read the encyclopedia and say, wow, these enlightened thinkers have some really good ideas. We should implement this into our lives, into our daily lives. And it starts to drive change, which leads to revolutions in a lot of senses. Denis Diderot is not the only one to drive change. All of these men and women are important for social and political change. But this is kind of the first work that is spread very rapidly amongst the populations, and very similar to Gutenberg's Bible and the 95 Thesis, and works of literature during the Reformation and the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution. We see that as a theme here with the encyclopedia during the Enlightenment. So that's Denis Diderot, famous for the encyclopedia. And then lastly, we have Adam Smith. Adam Smith is the only economist that we will talk about. He is a philosopher, and he's actually from Scotland. And he's Scottish / I'll call him Scottish / English. And he is considered the father of modern, or the father of economics and capitalism, which is a new term. We haven't talked about capitalism yet. And his most famous work of literature is called The Wealth of Nations. And he is kind of the first capitalist, a modern-day capitalist. And he basically believes that, we're going to talk, supply and demand 101 here, or macro and microeconomics. He believes in job specialization and consumer capitalism. And those two things are going to bring wealth. Now, we'll do some readings and we'll talk about them a little bit more in depth. But as an overview here, job specialization is specific jobs or specific careers in specific industries. So I always relate it to doctors. Today, there are hundreds, maybe not hundreds, but dozens of types of doctors. You have your cardiologists, you have your pediatricians, you have surgeons, you have dentists, you have people who focus on your ear, nose, and throat, ENTs. You have so many different types of doctors, all right, and just healthcare as a whole. Versus prior to modern day, healthcare, you were a doctor in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s even. You were just a doctor, right? 1700s. You went to school to become a doctor, and you were just a general practicer of medicine. Today, we have job specialization. That's going to bring wealth. Brain surgeons and cardiologists and, even pediatricians and different cardiac surgeons make a ton of money, and that's going to bring wealth. The second is consumer capitalism. And consumer capitalism is, well, consumerism as a whole is the idea that the consumer, people who purchase things, they are the ones that should drive the economy. All right. You and I are consumers. We buy what we need. We buy clothing. We buy technology. We buy cars. On the other side is producers. Those are the companies that make the products. But he says, no, consumer capitalism, what producers are making, yes, is important, but it's what consumers want that should drive the economy, that should drive the growth of wealth. So those are two things that we'll talk about. Obviously they mean a lot different. They mean different things today than they did in 1790. But Adam Smith was a revolutionary at that. He also believes in what's called the invisible hand, which is a very unique topic, still evident today. And the invisible hand is something that exists to guide economies to benefit them. If you think about an object, I always use the iPhone as an example. Technology is a good example, or cars, or something, physical. We'll take an iPhone, for example. Apple creates the iPhone. My phone's sitting right next to me here. This phone is in your hand, right? You didn't have to do anything to obtain this phone. You didn't have to, of course, you had to go and purchase it, but you didn't have to come up with this idea. You didn't have to put it together. You had to pay for it. You didn't have to pay for the shipping. Essentially you're paying for it to be shipped. But the creation of the iPhone, to get it from a producer to a consumer, is done so via this invisible hand. All right? And sometimes the economy does well and iPhones are selling, and sometimes it doesn't do well. But this invisible hand exists and kind of guides the market in order to work itself out. It maybe raises the price of technology, or it raises the price of an iPhone. It's the logistics of what we consider supply chain today, or the backgrounds of supply chain. So we'll do a little bit more reading on the invisible hand, but the idea is that it guides the economy, it guides products, it guides the markets to better fit, the current situation of what we need. All right, now maybe the iPhone wasn't the best example because it's a specific item. The invisible hand is more so the market as a whole, but it works itself out eventually, right? And that's kind of some of the ideas of capitalism, right? The consumer should determine what to buy. The invisible hand guides the economy, job specialization, creating capital, creating wealth is really important, and Adam Smith was a big advocate of that. All right, so I was rambling a little bit there, but that's Adam Smith. And those are all of our enlightened thinkers. Just to review, we had Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, Wollstonecraft, Diderot, and Adam Smith. All bring very new, sometimes radical, but new ideas to the table. We'll continue to monitor them. We'll stop here for now. Thank you.